as episode 410 on today, Thursday, April 8th, 2021. And I have been pestering Ms. Lopez for several weeks now because she unfortunately told me that she did a thesis on resources in Siberia. And because I'm a weirdo and I have interest in odd things, I've been pestering you to tell me about that like it's some sort of gossip. And I think I finally got you to cave, and you told me, beware, this thesis was written before you were born. I don't care. I want to hear it. And so, Ms. Lopez, for all the new listeners, please introduce yourself really quickly, and then let's jump into it.
Sure. So Clare Lopez, Lopez Liberty, LLC. And I went to graduate school at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. And it was there that I earned my master's degree in international relations with a Russia focus. And my primary thesis advisor and professor for multiple courses was an expert on Russia, and in particular on Russia and its geography sort of writ large, meaning and including not just, the expanse of the territory and the rivers and the mountains and all of that, but the natural resources of Russia. Mm-hmm. And so I got fascinated by that, and in particular about the resources in Siberia, which, as people probably know, spans, I don't know how many time zones. I think it's probably about 10 time zones, with only about 2 time zones far, to the west, nearest to Europe, where Moscow and some of the other big cities are. But the whole expanse from the Ural Mountains eastward is Siberia. And it's forbidding geography, forbidding topography, forbidding weather and climate. But it's chock full of all kinds of resources. And though that means mineral resources of all kinds, it means oil and gas, and it means other kinds of resources like timber and furs and other things. Mm-hmm. So this is what I wrote my thesis on way back when, and it was a fascinating study. Other colleagues of mine in the same program as me wrote also on Siberia. One of my friends, colleagues, wrote about the BAM, B-A-M, Baikal-Amur mainline railroad that runs from the west all the way to Lake Baikal, out in Siberia. The deepest lake in the world, yeah. And others wrote on related topics for their papers and theses. Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, this is a place that is forbidding, but at the same time rich, and so it's man against nature, I guess. Mm-hmm. How to get the oil and the gas out of tundra, permafrost, which for 10 months out of the year is frozen rock hard. And then for a bare 2 months out of the year, perhaps, it turns into pure slush, mud. How do you work in conditions like that? How do you manage vehicles when the cold is so bitter, tens and tens of degrees below zero is normal? How do you keep machinery running in that kind of environment? How do you keep wheels from just cracking up and exploding in the cold? How do you keep vehicles from sinking into the mud and the slush when the permafrost melts? And how do you then keep from inflicting, permanent environmental damage on that land, that surface area, when you're taking your tracked or your wheeled vehicles across it in such conditions? So all kinds of things, played into it. Fascinating. Of course, and, a tribute to the Russian people who live and work there all the way out east to Vladivostok, and the eastern and Kamchatka Peninsula and so forth of Russia. The other grimmer aspect of this is that, of course, Siberia is the place where, from the Tsars to Lenin and Stalin and the Soviet communists established the gulags. And of course, we read about this, especially Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, and other writing. This is the grimmer side of Siberia: penal camps, labor camps, forced labor camps.
Yeah.
So all of that, played into my master's study and thesis.
Yeah, it's. I was gonna say one. I want to get him on. My uncle Bob, who's like a fish and game expert up in New Hampshire, but he did security for an oil company up in Alaska, and it's just like it's like this huge multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, and then they hire down to earth Bob, and he was up there with a rifle looking at the perimeter for bears to make sure. It's just this odd, but. I just finished a book. Richard Rhodes, the guy who wrote Making of the Atomic Bomb, he has another book called Energy, and it's all about from timber in 1700s Britain to present day, pushing the edge of fusion research. And I'm reading another book right now called Private Empire about ExxonMobil. And really, I read Energy, and now I'm reading Private Empire, starting from our talk last week about. At the tail end, I was saying something about resources and how it's kind of becoming a blossoming interest of mine. But I say everything about that in my uncle and those two books because it's starting to see, how do you get all of this ridiculous, it's kind of the imagery of everything in Siberia. It kind of seems like a freezer. The freezer you have in your basement of all the frozen meats, if everything else goes bad, at least you have a freezer full of meats. There's kind of a weird imagery of there's a Russian freezer. If everything else goes to shit, we can thaw out the freezer. But point of me saying, I know I'm rambling, is even back in the 1930s, reading about oil companies going to Saudi Arabia or maybe early 40s or something. And it's, well, how else would this ever get done? It's at a time when Model Ts are barely in the rearview mirror, and they're talking about drilling, 3,700 feet down in the middle of the desert. And and there's only one answer, and it's if there's massive capital payoff. That's how this stuff gets done, right? That's, how does organic life obey the laws of thermodynamics? It's because we give off heat, and that offsets the complexity. But that's how all this stuff gets done. And I think that's probably subconsciously why I've been so interested in your thesis about Siberia, because it's really a complex way of saying where there's a will, there's a way. And it doesn't matter what it is, right? There's the easy tap stuff, the oceans of oil under the Middle East. But as we exhaust those, we're starting to see other places that we're going to have to turn to, whether it's rare earth metals in Africa or, what you're saying, everything in Siberia. And to me, that's just wildly fascinating.
Well, here we can bring this right up into the current day, as you're doing there, Tommy, and that is the balance in the prices of oil, right? And how the OPEC nations balance production versus their price level and their break-even price level. And how does that affect American production for oil and gas, in places like Texas or the Dakotas or wherever. And it's a balancing act. And then you get into things like the difficulty of extracting the oil and the gas out of Siberia, which is rather deep down, versus the relative ease of extracting oil in places like Saudi Arabia, with the largest oil reserves on the face of the earth that we know of so far anyway. Much less expensive to get it out of the ground for Saudis, and therefore their break-even point is a it's a much lower number than the break-even point for the Russians, who have to expend so much more money and resources to get the oil out. And this had to do with the price wars and discussions and everything that went on last year in 2020. We might remember that there had been talks going on in the early part of 2020 within OPEC and certainly between the Russians and the Saudis, and about production caps or levels, and it got so acrimonious that, remember, President Trump actually stepped in and helped broker some sort of an arrangement agreement, that worked for all of us, including the United States at that time, energy independent. Who knows now, with everything being shut down by the current administration. But all of this plays into it.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to... So right now, I don't know how topical this will be in the future, but I guess it doesn't matter. Is because I remember in like 2014, I was living at home with my oldest brother at the time, and it was kind of the weirdest. It was kind of the weirdest thing because I remember we would watch on Ustream, Ustream, the original site that I think hosted Joe Rogan, but we would watch on Ustream live like video bloggers from Crimea. And it was the weirdest thing because he, instead of watching like not to belittle their plight, but instead of like watching Netflix or something, we would like stay up at these weird hours because the time difference is so much. And he and I would sit up and we'd like drink coffee or beer and we'd watch like the invasion of Crimea with not Russian forces, right? And it was an odd memory just watching like live streaming revolution, like eating popcorn, like wow. But we kind of see it happening right now, right? Isn't it? I might be wrong, but isn't Russia? They've been saying it for a while, but doesn't Russia seem to be getting ready to invade Ukraine?
Well, let's go back into a little bit of history.
Okay.
So, between the roughly 1200s up until the 1800s and even World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire conquered an enormous expanse for Islam, for jihad, by way of jihad. And parts of southeastern Europe belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So did Crimea. So did much of the Caucasus. And then in the 1700s, along comes Catherine the Great, who liberated Crimea from the Ottoman Turks. And it, from then on, was part of Russia. And they were happy to be free of the Turks and thrilled to be back in the bosom of Mother Russia, because, of course, they're Slavs, they're Russians. And that was the case up through and including the revolution in Russia, 1917, and the establishment of the various socialist republics of Russia, USSR, and Ukraine was one of those. Well, through all of this time, Crimea was part of Russia. Crimea is Russian. Until the year 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev is beginning to consolidate or to aim for consolidation of his power, his accession to the leadership after the 1953 death of Stalin, right? And in 1954, for whatever reason, and nobody even knows why exactly, to this day, Khrushchev got the idea that he was going to detach Crimea from Russia and just give it to Ukraine for no reason. The Crimeans weren't happy. The Russians weren't happy. Ukrainians said, okay, but what's the difference? We're all still stuck inside the Soviet Union, so it's kind of a wash. And that was fine up until the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991. And then Ukraine went its own independent way along with the other republics of the former USSR. And what happened? Crimea gets dragged along with Ukraine. But they don't want to be Ukraine, they want to be Russia. And so when under Putin now, the Russians moved to take back Crimea, people who don't know this history,
I didn't,
got all wrapped around the axle.
I didn't know it until you were telling me right now.
And yet, the people of Crimea, there was a referendum, they want to be part of Russia,
Okay.
not part of Ukraine. Now, I draw a line, okay? And that line has to do with Russian aggression against Ukraine proper and the eastern part of Ukraine, the region that's called the Donbass.
Mm-hmm.
That's another story. That's aggression. Okay, that is Putin and Russia, testing to see how far they can go, invading, using proxy forces to invade, militia forces to invade eastern Ukraine. And that's a much more conflicted situation than ever Crimea was.
Okay.
So I would draw the line there. That is wrong. That's aggression, and that needs to be stopped. And we, the United States, need to take a stand against that. Under President Trump, of course, we did finally. And we, the United States, actually finally agreed to provide the Ukrainian government with defensive weaponry, like anti-tank missiles to defend themselves against encroaching Russian tanks. Under President Biden, whose family, shall we say, is so compromised in Ukraine, don't know what the policy is going to be exactly, but that's a bit of history for you.
Okay, so it seems like Crimea is like the child, and Russia like re-won custody of it. But now Russia is trying to take a child of Ukraine that it didn't have with Russia. Is that a decent analogy?
Well, borders have shifted back and forth across that Euro-Asian landmass forever, right? But I think a case can be made, that Ukraine has a border. It has, a land border with Russia, and that needs to be respected. I do separate Crimea away. We could also get into all kinds of things going on in the Black Sea and encroachment by Russian naval vessels and so forth.
What's happening there?
On Ukrainian waters, fishing, naval, all of that. Okay, that's in the Black Sea. But on the land, I do draw the line with Ukraine's land borders. With Russia, that is Ukraine, and has been for a very long time. Despite, yes, the borders have shifted back and forth. Certainly, World War II, during, before, after. But that is where we need to hold the line. Along the same lines as the Transnistria, Romania and Moldova. There are other land borders like that where Russia is pushing, in the Caucasus, Abkhazia, and around up there with Ossetia and Georgia, and the different Caucasus republics. This is Moscow pushing to see how far it can go.
Yeah, I completely forgot about Georgia. Actually, I vaguely remember it when I was living in the state of Georgia. But yeah, it kind of seems like a pattern, right? They go mess with Georgia, and then they kind of lay low for a couple of years. Crimea, lay low a couple of years. Now it's Donbass. And are we coming up on, if you could loosely draw an analogy to the Berlin airlift, where the Soviets drew the line and said, we're cutting off here. Let's see if America will play their hand, and they'll use nuclear weapons. And then we kind of skirted around it with the round-the-clock air bridge, and that was like the first bullet dodged of the Cold War, right? The first time it could have come to blows, and instead we both juked each other. the next one will
Well,
probably...
I don't see U.S. or Western or NATO forces becoming directly involved in Ukraine versus Russia. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But nevertheless, I mean, there are lines that can be drawn. Again, providing Ukraine with defensive assistance, for example, sanctions against Putin, against Russia. That's been done under the Trump administration. Those kinds of things. But I don't see Western forces becoming themselves directly involved. No.
What I meant was it's similar in the way that, are we seeing kind of like, is, you know, the lines in the sand, is it being crossed? I know they're not part of NATO, but in general, they're seeing how far they can go. So, you know, if they take Crimea, well, then I'm sure there's someone there that's using the example you cited, and it was like, they always wanted to be part of Russia. And it's like, okay. Well, now if they're looking at Donbass, or it's like they're pushing that, at a certain point, I would imagine they have to look at, like, where are we going to draw the line? Because if they push that, they're going to keep pushing it. Kind of like, is China going to take Taiwan? Are they going to invade Hong Kong? Like, they already kind of are. What I mean is, where is the line going to be drawn? Are we going to see a resurrecting of the whole domino theory from the 60s and 70s? Or are we just, I don't know, have we kind of lost the teeth? Are we just going to keep drawing a line and then going?
There's a lot of questions with our current administration, which is, you know, generally viewed by friends, adversaries alike as a pile of limp spaghetti. So, you know, every rogue on the face of the earth is pushing to see what the limits are, or if there even are going to be any limits.
So what do you think? Are we going to see? Is Putin going to try to put back together some form of the Soviet Union? Do you think?
No, not like that.
You don't think so?
He's pushing at the edges, right? Ukraine is the edges, and Ukraine has always been for Russia, going back centuries, kind of its strategic depth. I don't know if you know what the word Ukraine actually means. In Ukrainian or in Russian, which are very close, but they're different, they're distinct, but close, Slavic languages, Ukraine is actually two words, Ukraina. U means at, Kraina means the farthest out, border. So at the farthest border is the name of the country of Ukraine. Well, of what is it the farthest border? Of Muscovy, of the Duchy of Muscovy, of, you know, the empire as it was built, Peter and Catherine and so forth. So Ukraine has always been this kind of farthest out buffer zone, strategic depth, if you will, for Moscow. But nevertheless, never mind. It is an independent country, and it is recognized as such, and we need to recognize and defend it as such as well. And I don't mean with military forces on the ground or in the air, but I mean with every other measure that we can muster.
There's this BBC video where it's like a faux BBC video. It was like an art project someone did or something years ago, but it's how would World War III kind of look in real time, like not from like a general's view, not like how would you and I see it just on the news. And I think it starts in like the Black Sea or near Ukraine, and it starts with like Russia moving, and then the US, you know, saying like we stand with like the Ukrainian people. It's something eerily similar. It's like 10 years old. And
there sure could be a flashpoint there, yeah.
And then how it breaks out is like there's this like conventional buildup where it's like you see naval ships and destroyers and like missile cruisers, and then you see it escalating to like, you know, tons of fighter jets going in the air, and it really takes place in the matter of like 4 or 5 hours. I mean, truly, from like peaceful, like, you know, this morning's weather and the Red Sox are playing the Yankees, to all out, to finally it ends with like there was like a nuclear burst over like Brussels or something, and then the screen goes to like a emergency alert broadcast, and it's like, make sure you have 14 days of food and water, like cover yourself in an inner sanctum if you have any, and then it turns to this red flashing signal and it says like impact imminent, and then the screen just stops and you just hear like the background radiation of a thermonuclear blast, like no electronics work anymore, but the whole thing is supposed to play out in 4 hours. And it's scaring the shit out of me that
it's compressed scenario for sure, and nothing that we expect to happen like that. But nevertheless, over the last days and weeks, Russia has been amassing military force, its own Russian military force on the border with Ukraine, whereas previously through much of this conflict, it's been proxy forces that have been used, plausible deniabilities, I suppose. Everybody knows, but now it's actual Russian forces in a kind of a show of force. Is it saber rattling? Do they actually mean to invade? Are they testing to see if anybody's home at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? How far will they go? And that's a question mark right now.
It makes me think of like World War One. Who's his face? Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, which is possibly the best recap of World War One ever. It's like 6 parts. Each part is like 3 hours. But he talks about how after World War One, generals were talking from like both sides, and they were like, now they're in their 90s, and it's like, how did this all start? And I think the response is, if we only knew. We just stumbled over a cliff in the night. Kennedy apparently quoted those generals in October 1962, saying, I don't want in some distant future in some nuclear bunker the survivors of humanity to look back at October 1962 and say, how did it all happen? And to say, if we only knew. But it paints this picture of, it's not always this black and white. Hitler invaded Poland. Oh no, they're burning Jews and they bombed Pearl Harbor. And it's like, I know that's a gross simplification, but it's pretty like defined as like, all right, well, they're blowing up our oil tankers off our coast with U-boats. It's time to go to war. It seems that sometimes, World War One, behind World War II, the biggest, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, which avoided, but could have been the biggest conflict in human history and the last. Is it right now? Is this the fog, the sort of pre-fog that maybe in the future they'll look at? It's like us saying...
Well, the one thing I would say about now is that the availability of information in real time is so much greater than it ever has been in history before. So there is pretty good knowledge about who's moving where with what forces. The question now comes down to more, I think, one of willpower, of upholding the international system of order, such as it is, whatever it is. Unknowns perhaps include, let's go back to Russia again, the extent to which Putin and Xi Jinping of China are working together, collaborating, plotting together, but those kinds of things may not be as well known. But certainly physical movements of forces are known in real time, and some of those forces, hypersonic missiles, can move with incredible speed. But right now, I think what we're looking at is the centrifugal forces of the world system starting to fly off, if you will, figuratively speaking, kind of. And I've talked about this poem on a couple of other interviews, programs that I've done recently. And it's from William Butler Yeats. You mentioned World War I. This poem was written in 1919. Just after the end of World War I and its horrors for Europe, when so many of the best young men of the continent lay dead. And William Butler Yeats wrote a poem called The Second Coming. And it's not long, but in it, and in the first stanza, I'll just tell you part of it. He says something like, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Now, I'm not saying the entire stanza, but that's what comes to mind here with what we're seeing begin to happen. And it's absent strong leadership, the center, if you will, in Washington, D.C. Under Trump, things were hanging together. Not perfect, and plenty of warfare all over the place, but in general, the world system of order kind of was hanging together. But that's not true now. It's flying apart. Things fall apart the center cannot hold because of the limp pile of spaghetti in the White House. That's all. When the U.S. is absent in leadership from the world, chaos follows.
Yeah, it's another piece of Dan Carlin's bit on World War I is another quote, and it's it's like the first use of the term doomsday machine, but it's kind of about maybe it was Bismarck's or whoever. It was the whole interlocking connections of World War I that kind of, or of Europe prior to World War I that kept it breaking out in a war. But the idea was, and it was also the technology at the time, right? It wasn't live feed, HD satellites and hypersonic missiles. A lot of it was, once the trains started moving, like I think one quote is like the Germans started mobilizing, and I think at one point they were like, actually, let's bring them back. And the general was like, you can't stop this once it starts. But maybe that was a sign of technology at the time. But anyway, the quote is, one of the generals says, kind of once this doomsday machine, once the gears start turning of all the nations, well, if they get attacked, we have to defend them. Well, if we defend them, they're going to, and it's this, but he describes it as the lights, or I guess the oil lamps, have gone out in Europe, and I fear not they will be on, I fear they will not be on again for a long time.
Yeah. Well, that was this interlocking, network of alliances that bound countries to each other in opposition to the other bloc. And that, in part, at least, is what set off, the spiral into World War I.
Now, do you think that, are we going to see, an absence of leadership, do you think this is something where the military state or the Pentagon would idly stand by, or are we going to see the movements or the reverberations of the silhouette of the so-called deep state? Are we going to see kind of like Curtis LeMay used to say, I don't need, he used to say, like, I don't need approval to use the A-bomb. If the Soviets are attacking my nation, I'm not going to sit here fat, dumb, and happy. I'm going to go get the bomb, and I'm going to go deliver it to targets.
No. Just stop right there. Perish the thought. The United States military is under civilian control.
Yeah.
The commander-in-chief of the U.S. military is the president.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm not saying that's anything I want. I'm just looking at examples of people that, I guess you're right, because, Truman kind of smacked MacArthur around when he stepped out of line. I don't know, LeMay stayed in charge.
We could argue. I mean, who was right? MacArthur driving for the Yalu River, or President Truman, who called a stop to it all, and then we think of what happened, since. But nevertheless, the commander-in-chief is the president of the United States. And in any case, our military has been so badly degraded. Trump did the best he could to build it back up again. But, now what we're seeing from the commanders, the Secretary of Defense, General Lloyd Austin on down, 6 months off to look for white supremacy in the ranks, 6 months off on stand down or whatever it is, to figure out if they need to approve transgender surgical operations. This is absurd at a time when the Chinese military openly is talking about, manning up and beefing up its military forces, which do not include female flight suits, beefing up its military to be more formidable. And, here we are.
So is this all, do you think that this could all be, in, I guess, tinfoil hat time, is this all the fingerprints of China involvement in the U.S., get within and break down the mill, or is it just our own? Are we Rome in the bags?
It's both. It's been trends in the United States going way back. I think we've talked about Antonio Gramsci's long march through the institutions of communism and Marxism, with explicit goals that were mentioned in chapter 13 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. And among those 45 goals were things like, degrade the popular culture, make obscenity and pornography commonplace, degrade, our school curriculum, degrade our respect for foundational principles, respect for founding fathers, the heroes, the settlers, the immigrants even of this country. Degrade everything that is good and wholesome in society. All of that's been going on for many, many decades. I would say that the Chinese Communist Party leadership of the international communist movement, including the Communist Party of the United States, is of more recent vintage. It is not Moscow that leads global communism anymore. They're still in the mix. They're obviously still there. But the leadership of global communism, Marxism, Maoism today is Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. That's the adversary. And yes, they are involved in our popular culture. I mean, look at a platform like TikTok, which is an AI CCP collection platform. Look at the interference in our elections last year by the Chinese out of their Houston consulate. We've talked about that. And the overwhelming influence of Chinese propaganda through its United Front Work Department. The propaganda, the information operations flowing through all of our media, print media, online social media, TV channels and cable TV and all the rest of it. Massive Chinese Communist Party influence, which I do not see being challenged or checked at this point in time. Rather, it's, the limp spaghetti in the White House that is being challenged and checked.
Will things change if, I don't think, and this is for the record, Secret Service, don't come pounding down my house, I don't think Biden's going to make it till 2022. And I don't necessarily mean living, although he might. I don't think he'll be the president in 2020. And I could be wrong. I mean, I might look back at this and that it won't age well. Let's say Kamala takes over. Are we going to see at least someone who's cognitively there? Maybe not someone I agree with, but I'd at least have some. I'd at least rather have someone I disagree with who's at least cognitively there and is admittedly ruthless, as opposed to,
Well, I mean, I think we've seen the leadership, in air quotes, capabilities of the current vice president. Not impressive. Rather, I think what we're seeing already even now is a kind of a collective oligarchic leadership in Washington, D.C. that includes top ranks of the Democrat Party, senior figures, certainly including a Nancy Pelosi, a Chuck Schumer, in Congress, plus other leadership figures of the Democrat Party around the country. That's who's running the country right now. It's not the figureheads, whether they remain in those positions or not. It's an oligarchy that is running the United States right now.
So I guess the big question is, does China have a superior system? And I don't mean that, full disclaimer, I don't mean that I approve of it. I don't approve of the work camps or the detentions or the concentration camps of Uyghurs and Christians or the mass censorship. But from a truly just detached, ruthless, psychopathic standpoint, you know, like reading about ExxonMobil, like nature selects for psychopaths. Do they have a more, if you will, genetically or maybe geopolitically fit system, the system that will go on and flourish? Is unrestricted warfare and the long march through institutions and just the hammer of censorship and police stating and social credit scores, is that the most efficient system? I mean, it's demonic and it's everything against humanity, but just looking at it completely detached, is that the most? I mean, I can also see where if you were in 1940s, you'd go, hey, man, that's the way to run a country. You know, a country the size of Maine is taking over Europe and they're killing millions, but they're efficient. But then we see that they don't win. You know, Japan, man, they're highly efficient. They all think their leader is an actual god. They commit suicide instead of surrendering. But they're not the ones who won. It was Britain and America and France. Do they have a more fit system? Is that like the black pill? Or do they have a more vicious fit system, or is this the same as like reading your own press releases? Am I seeing them as this efficient monolith? In reality, do they have as many internal cracks and erosions that we have? But I only see ours because I live here and grew up here. Does that make sense?
No, tyranny will never, ever be a better system than a system of free people. And the reasons are many. Partly because they only can maintain power through force, coercion, and terror, and that only lasts so long before either a rival tyranny comes up to challenge them, and or the people themselves rise up from below and demand an end to tyranny. There are many fissures and fractures within communist systems. The Russian one, certainly the Chinese one. But the other reason is that inherently a system of free people has more potential. It has a better reason to fight, to exist, to triumph. What does a tyrannical system have as motivation? Self-perpetuation? That's not enough.
Yeah.
Free people have a far more driving, a better system, a better impulse to live free, than tyrannies do, against the worst odds. And sometimes it takes a very, very long time for the forces of the free people to reassert themselves. But in the end, because free people are not cowed by terror and coercion, because they're not cowed by defeat even, but will continue on fighting until they can achieve their freedom, because they look to higher values, because many look to divine inspiration, because many of them, have an inner strength that derives from that freedom, from that belief in a divine. If they do, they have, in the end, a far better chance of succeeding, of victory than tyrannies do.
Hell yeah. That just got me amped up. I was trying not to pound my table. I was like, fuck yeah, Claire. Excuse my French. It makes me think of I don't even remember who said it. Someone on one of my early podcasts said it, but they're using the analogy of like the cell membrane, right? And which way does the gradient flow? I mean, if you have more water in this bucket than this bucket, the gradient flows to that bucket. We call it physics, but if you draw an analogy, the simplest way to determine which system is the superior system, is you just put a physical wall between the countries, And if you have to have a wall to keep people in, and the other one has to have a wall to keep people out, well, where the gradient is going is where humanity lies. You don't have to have a wall to keep people out of North Korea. We have to build a wall on the southern border to keep people from trying to get in.
Yeah, no, the attractiveness, I mean, just the pure attractiveness of a free society draws people. There is something in human nature. Yes, many people, too many, are willing to be sheep and lemmings going, crashing off the cliff. I'll have to say that I was deeply disappointed in my fellow Americans to see how many were willing to simply go along like a bunch of sheep and lemmings during this last year. Deeply disappointed, but there is now forming a course correction to that, and that is the grassroots swell of free people in this country, and I think this happens in other places too. There is something in human nature that wants to be free. No, not everybody. There are loads of people in this world who are perfectly happy to be slaves. And that may sound absurd. It might sound crazy, but it's true.
That's true.
They are perfectly happy to be slaves and to be taken care of. But on the other hand, is this never-ending, this drive, this impulse of human nature to live free. And that will consistently and always rise back up again.
That was beautiful. It's kind of like that. I think it's Da Vinci. Was it a quote? It was about like flight, and obviously he didn't fly. Maybe it was in his dream, or maybe it was one of the early pilots. I don't know. But it was like the quote is something like once you experience flight, the rest of your life you will never be able to focus on the ground. Your eyes will always be upwards towards the heavens, knowing like what is up there. And I kind of look at that as like, once in America exists with all of its flaws, but once in America exists, it's like you can't really ever not think about it, right? I mean, it's the reason why I have friends from Bulgaria and Kosovo who, I talk about it before, my buddy Prince, who's a personal or a physical therapist now in New York. But I remember when I met him in 2014 in Ocean City, we were doing security together. Barely spoke a lick of English. I mean, he carried a switchblade around. He grew up in Kosovo. His dad was a journalist and had his arms and legs broken by the Serbs for covering what he thought was war crimes. Ivan, from a small apartment block in Sofia, Bulgaria. He's a 6'4" bodybuilder now. He was Mr. Bulgaria. Now he lives in Las Vegas. He wins gold medals left and right. He is the next Arnold Schwarzenegger, mark my words. But those are guys who, I mean, these are guys who are just obnoxious, just red, white, and blue hats, flags in their cars, American Eagles, like, bobbleheads on their dashboards everywhere they go. And it's America number one. And like, if anyone ever tried to say anything to them like, oh, you nationalist Nazi, I mean, they just look them dead in the, and whereas I would get like heated under the collar, I'd be like, what's wrong with loving America? These guys it just rolls off their back like water, like beads up off the back of a duck. They just look at me and they're like, America number one, you have no idea how good you have it. USA. And when I see them, I'm always like, that, it's always kind of like the tree of liberty must be, watered with the blood of tyrants from time to time. I look at immigrants like that, and it's almost like the base of America needs to be watered with these hungry, freedom-loving immigrants from time to time, because when you have people that grow up here, it's very easy to fall into this America bad, being white is bad, and Uncle Sam is evil, America's a third world country with a Gucci belt. You kind of need those hungry guys that come in and just
with real life experience.
Yes.
In their lifetimes, or certainly those of their family, they live through this stuff. And Americans, we tend to get a little complacent sometimes because we don't know our history, as I've said before. And we just think the way things are is the way things are always going to be. And that's not true unless we take care of it. Yeah.
I mean, I remember, I imagine they will have kids that will grow up and succeed. And then several generations down the road, the ancestors of Prince and Ivan, they will be spoiled, rotten Americans who don't know what they have. But by then, there will be another wave of immigrants that come in who will be hungry for freedom. But I'll never remember when Prince came to this house. I remember he came over, and there's two things that happened. There was an air show. There were fighter jets going overhead, and I remember he like ran inside, and I was like, Prince, it's like July 4th. It's F-22 Raptors. They're gonna break the sound barrier. And he's like, whenever I see fighter jets, he's like, it's never been good. And I was just like, holy shit. And another thing is I remember, this is back before I'd ever even used Instagram, but I remember he came to my house. I mean, it's a nice house, but it's just a house. I remember he came and was like, take a picture of me. And I was like, what? And he was kind of the same way I would maybe take a picture in front of, like, I don't know, Michael Jordan's house, like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, do like that. Prince came over and he literally like got down on like 2 knees and was doing like gang signs. And I was like, why are you doing this? And he was like, the mowed lawn, none of the windows are broken, and there was 2 Honda Civics in the driveway. And I realized to him that was like big pimping. And he came inside, and I swear to God, and this wasn't even funny, it was just sad. I remember he opened the refrigerator. He opened the refrigerator and the freezer, and he asked me to take a picture of them because it was fully stocked. And I remember I was just like, and so every day when I would come to work with him, I would bring him just like a sandwich. My mom would pack him a lunch, and every day he would like choke up. And he'd be like, we are brothers. And I'd be like, Prince, it's really all right, man. I'll bring you a sandwich. It's okay. And like he was, but it's kind of we'll end on this kind of funny side note. He took it so personally that, we were his American family, that I remember, we were doing security at this apartment complex, and it was a bunch of 16-year-olds down here for spring break. And like this kid, just a bunch of brats drinking, and I didn't give a shit. And I went up, and I would try to be the cool security guard because I used to remember what it was like to be a young kid drinking when you weren't supposed to. And I'd go knock on the doors, and I'd be like, hey guys, I know you have alcohol, you got to keep it down, otherwise the owner's going to call the cops. 99% of them were like, oh bro, thank you. Because I remember when guys would do that to me when I was younger, they'd be like, keep it down, I don't want to call the cops on you. You'd be like, all right, I got you, appreciate it. And I opened this one door, and there was this kid who had like braces, like reeking of vodka. I was like 24 at the time, and I was like, hey man, you got to be quiet. And he like pushed me. And this kid weighs as much as my right arm. And I was like, but before I could even do anything, I remember Prince grabbed the kid by the neck and like whipped out a knife. And he was like, I cut you like pig. And I like pulled Prince back. I was like, Prince, I love the energy, I love the enthusiasm, and I love the faithfulness. But you can't do that here. And he's like, I'm sorry. He's like, this man, he's like, attacked my family. And I was like, Prince. And he later confided in me that because I had brought him lunch every day and shown him what the United States was all about, he was ready to kill a 16-year-old for me. And maybe that's not the best example, but to me, that always sticks out in my mind when I'm like, it helps me remember that you're right. A tyrannical system can't win, because you have guys like that come over that want an Instagram photo in front of a stocked refrigerator of bananas and deli meat. And I'm kind of just going off on a tangent now, but this was, I greatly appreciated this talk. I needed that kind of, that tough love. Like, no, a tyrannical system can exist for a while. It can be, and it can be a dark period. But yeah, how can it go on? For what? Self-perpetuation? For what purpose? There has to be a place of freedom. So I know I've been ranting for the last 5 minutes, but thank you very much, Claire. I needed that refresher.
Yeah, no, I really believe all of this, and those are great examples. I think your audience will appreciate hearing about them.
Yeah, I need to get both of those guys on here because they're I've been trying to get them on, but Prince now lives in Manhattan. He's a physical therapist and he speaks perfect English, and it's just like, what he is. If someone drew up that character and said this is the American dream, whoever was in charge of PR would say, no, this is too cheesy. You got to water it down a little bit. But that's who this guy is. So now I'm getting all jacked up. All jacked up. So I gotta go for a run now. I gotta let off some steam. Okay. Clare Lopez, as always, thank you so much for being on here. You're a great American, and I'm so appreciative of you being on here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, Claire. God
Take
bless.
care.
Take care. You as well.